This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Well, hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm pleased to introduce you to Giovanni Ruscitti. Giovanni is a first, I was nervous. Giovanni is a first-generation Italian-American who grew up in Frederick, Colorado, which is a small coal mining town that his parents and grandparents immigrated to in the 1950s and early 1960s. He is a nationally recognized attorney, arbitrator, and mediator, as well as a frequent speaker at national legal events, and was named as one of the most influential business leaders in Colorado. He's also served on numerous nonprofit boards. Giovanni joins me today to talk about his memoir, Cobblestones, Conversations in Corks, a son's discovery of his Italian heritage. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Giovanni.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
I'm happy to have you here. I love the fact that you've got Corks in the title of your book, because I do like to uncork stories here, and you can see from my background there's a couple of Corks there.
Love it.
But I want to start with asking you the question I ask everybody to begin, which is, Giovanni, where does your story begin?
This story, the book is it's really a father-son story, father-son kind of relationship that evolves over time, like we all have with our parents. And it's also a story about discovering your identity, who you are, which a lot of us, think about, we struggle with. It's a subject of a lot of philosophy. And for me, I was always very comfortable with who I was and what I do. And as you mentioned, I have a very active legal career, and with a name like Giovanni Ruscitti, clearly knew my heritage, but I didn't understand and appreciate my heritage until I took a trip to my parents' ancestral town and my entire family, going back many, many generations. And that trip, Mike, really brought into context and light part of my identity that I didn't appreciate, and really a major understanding of the context of my family's, and in particular my father's upbringing. It started with, and to answer your question directly, our story really starts in World War II on November 11th, 1943, when the Nazis came in, and this was part of this big campaign that they had to take over these small towns in central Italy. And my family's from Cansano, which is in Abruzzo, a very small mountainous part of Italy. And they were using that to try and combat the Americans and the Polish who were coming up through Sicily. And they kicked out my family. My father was 7, my mom was 4, into the mountains, very rugged mountains. And that event that day kind of changed the scope of their then existence, but also their near-term future. And then ultimately it shaped my life and many other people's lives.
Yeah. So where did they go? I mean, from the mountains, how did they survive? How did they adjust to sort of a new life?
It was a shock for them. The Nazis had come in about a month before and set up kind of a little area, an office to kind of monitor what was happening. But the mountains, if you know anything about central Italy, the mountains are very rugged, lots of rocks and high trees, and very dangerous. And in winter, very cold. So they literally were living in makeshift tents with no food. They had a couple hours to vacate, and they lived in those conditions for almost 6 months. And then when they returned to their town after the Americans were able to thankfully take back over control of the town in central Italy, everything was gone. All of their valuables were taken. Their homes were destroyed. And Mike, one of the interesting things about this trip is when I went there in 2013 for the first time, I was 46, and I'd heard so many stories about the town. A lot of it had not recovered from that day. It wasn't bombed, but the people just were forced. They had to endure this extreme poverty that shapes someone's life.
Yeah.
And so they struggled for many years, and then eventually did what a lot of people did in Europe and certainly Italy, and that is immigrate for a better life and came to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, there's many aspects to sort of kind of recovering from something like that. There's economic recovery, but there's also psychological recovery. And to see like your home, where you lived, where you grew up, all of the things that are tied to it, just kind of eviscerated. I imagine that's a huge psychological toll on somebody.
Yeah, those are stories that my folks told myself and my sisters several times. Well, not several times. If my dad told a story once, he told it 1,000 times. So I'd heard these stories so many times, but until you actually go to a place like this, it has no context. And suddenly, stories of how he, as a young boy at 10 years old, had to cut down timber and walk 10 miles to the nearest town to make money for his family came to life. And I had a different appreciation for my father that I didn't have before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great empathy building exercise, I imagine. So when they came over here to the United States, what did he do? What was his occupation? What was his trade?
My dad was one of those guys who was truly one of the hardest working individuals I've ever met. And Mike, we spend so much time in our society in this country focusing on celebrities, actors, actresses, athletes, politicians, and really, I think the story of the ordinary man, like my father and my mother, those are the folks who lived extraordinary lives and built this country. And I wrote this book as a promise to my father right before he passed away. He said somebody should tell our story, and I wasn't sure I could actually ever do it as a full-time practicing attorney, managing partner of our firm. But in 2020, we were going through so much in this country, including, BLM issues and social unrest and political unrest. But there was so much targeting of immigrants that I felt really compelled to start writing down the story. I had no idea it was going to turn into what it is today. And it's been so well received. I've received comments from people all over the world. Every day I get someone messages me in some forum. But my dad was this industrious person. He came here with literally the shirt on his back, no education, couldn't speak or read or write English. And the Italians and Irish were heavily discriminated against in the 50s. So my dad had to endure a lot of that. And so did my mom. And, so that shaped him, which in turn shaped us, because he always talked about the fact that you have to respect everyone doing any job. And my dad was kind of an everyman. He did every job, to answer your question. He worked in construction. He was a custodian, which there's some stories in the book that I talk about. He used that actually to teach himself how to read and write, and then eventually become an entrepreneur by simply reading the Wall Street Journal when he was a custodian cleaning the executives' offices of the company he worked for. So he did everything, and that as a young boy, it was very inspiring to see that kind of work ethic. And my dad did not suffer a victim or a fool or lazy. He worked 2 or 3 jobs all the time, and that is kind of a work ethic that was instilled in all of us that I really, really was inspired by. And I still am to this day. It's something that motivates me to think back to what he had to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so much to unpack in what you just said, but just a few observations. Just immigrant stories. I love immigrant stories because we were all. I mean, if you live in this country, we're all not from here.
Exactly.
The Italian side of my family, so I'm half Italian, a quarter Irish, a quarter German. We don't talk about the German side so much because they may not have been on the right side of history, but who knows?
You never did. Well, they certainly weren't during that time period, but they got better.
No, not necessarily, but but I think about my own grandmother's stories. They came probably in the 20s, so well before World War II. But they came in the 20s, and she was a seamstress. She grew up, her father owned like a general store.
Right.
She was a seamstress, but life was not easy because there was, and this isn't really talked about as much, but there was a lot of discrimination against the Italians, against the Irish. That's one of the reasons why we had Catholic schools in this country is they weren't welcome in the public schools. And my grandmother would share those stories about growing up in I think they were first in Newark, and then they were in New York City, and then they wound up in Brooklyn. But you hear that, and we don't focus on it that much, and to some extent, I mean, it's not systemic, right? I mean,
Right.
it's there's other, I mean, racism still is alive and well, and I wouldn't say well, but it's still alive in this country. But you don't hear about it from the point of view of sort of those early immigrants. But that was certainly a real thing. But I love hearing that your dad was kind of taking on, these jobs and kind of building up, almost serving as a role model for you, it sounds. And here you are as a managing partner in a law firm. That had to make him very proud, right?
Yeah, my dad was one of those guys who no one is a perfect human being, right? And my dad was a typical Italian male immigrant, very, machismo, and he has kind of that background that, didn't always mesh well as a young American boy trying to assimilate into our country at the same time, not speaking English until I was 5 or 6 because my family was very Italian. But, my dad, notwithstanding the fact that he was discriminated against and was doing these absolute low-level jobs at minimum wage, which is shocking. He told me his first job was making $1.14 an hour, and he never let that judgment and that discrimination hold him back. And as I mentioned before, he did not suffer the victim or the fool or the lazy. He just motivated him. And so for me and my sisters and many others, he was very inspiring. In fact, when the book came out a couple weeks ago, a Hispanic man who he got to know, who came in and did some work on one of my dad's real estate properties. The guy was working for a different company, and my dad kind of took him under his wing and just started mentoring him for no reason. He just liked the guy. He was an immigrant from Mexico, and my dad encouraged him to do his own thing. And my dad always said, "You can do it." It was one of his phrases. He said, "If I could do it, I came here with nothing. You can do it." And he would tell everyone that. And he told this gentleman that. And that guy went on his own and formed his own business, and today is very successful. And those stories have been coming out from lots of people who have similar stories about immigrants. So I think, you talk about your grandparents and their stories. There are so many stories like this. And this goes back to the ordinary person living that extraordinary life that we just can't lose sight of. And so I was very honored and proud to be able to tell his story, not knowing what kind of audience it would have, although I assumed people would have some connection to it.
Yeah.
And it's been pretty inspiring to see.
That's good fodder for the second edition of your book, I imagine. All these stories that are coming out now.
Right.
So did I hear this right? You started writing this during the pandemic?
I started writing it on Labor Day weekend in 2020. I just felt this. I had this deep movement internally by the BLM movement, and I had heard, of course, about racism, but didn't really understand racism, and more importantly, Mike, anti-racism. So I started thinking about that and reading and remembering some of the things that my father and my mother and my grandparents went through, and I just felt compelled to discharge that or fulfill that promise that I made to him the year before when he passed away. But I had no idea that it was going to turn into a book. I had no outline. I'd never written a book. I obviously write a lot as a lawyer. I sat down with a pencil and a pad, and I just started writing. And suddenly, I decided to tell his story through this first trip that I took with him in 2013. It became kind of a spiritual, profound kind of, series of events, just writing out his life story. And I then gave it to a few friends to read. They said, "Hey, you should do something with this." And then I said, "Okay, I'll try and finish the story." Again, without knowing exactly where it was going to take me.
Yeah.
And then I ended up learning a lot about myself that, like I said before, that your sense of identity, you never really can appreciate. Usually it's some major life event that occurs that forces you to step back. And for me, it was my father's passing. And I learned a lot about myself and how I really became, what I do today.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I learned so much from authors on this show, and there are some consistent themes. One of them is if if you want to start writing, you have to start writing, right? It all starts with writing the first sentence, then the first paragraph, and the first chapter. And that's advice I give aspiring authors. Ask me all the time. They're like, Mike, you've written 8 books. You talk to all these authors. What's your advice? I want to write a book. And the first thing is just start writing. And then the second thing I tell people is you're going to be surprised at how much you learn about yourself during the writing process, because whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, you're putting yourself into the story somehow. And you do uncover these insights. And in many ways, writing is a form of therapy. There's a therapeutic process that happens when you are writing.
Oh, totally. And when you finish it, and then, I was fortunate enough to work with a great publisher and a great team of, publicist and marketing person. And the book was about to come out. You suddenly start having this imposter syndrome.
Oh, absolutely.
Who's going to want to read my book? Yeah, I've got an interesting life, but why is anyone going to read our story? But as I step back and really started thinking about it, hearing how other people, I love being inspired. I can be inspired so many different ways. I love to read. And by the way, thank you for your show. I think it's great for authors, and it's a great platform. So I appreciate what you're doing. I was really hoping that this story would inspire others. And I've gotten so many messages from people. I got a call yesterday from somebody saying, I don't know what I'm going to write about, but you've inspired me to write. And lots of people have been saying, hey, I love this. I love your writing style. What are you going to do next? So I've started thinking about that, and I really enjoyed the process. But you're right, you have to sit down and start. And not only was it therapeutic, it's also cathartic, because, if you've had a parent pass, getting to, say some of the things that maybe you didn't get a chance to is very important.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. The other theme that comes up is the importance of encouragement. And it sounds like you had some encouragement along the way, giving some, early drafts to people who are encouraging, hey, you got to do more with this. You should finish it. To the, even hearing after it's published, hearing how, you impacted someone else's life. That, to me, like when I hear, feedback like that, it's okay. Well, if this book never becomes a bestseller, it doesn't matter, because it's impacted somebody. And it might sound cliched, but if you can just impact one life with this work, then it's, in my mind, it's a bestseller. It's better than a bestseller because it's done something to motivate someone else.
Mike, I think about that all the time. And what I do as a managing partner of my firm, I'm always, lawyers are not viewed as thought leaders, and I'm always bringing in speakers into our firm to talk to our partners and other folks about, how we can improve individually. And I think it's one of those things that we all should take a step back and say, how do I improve who I am? That sense of identity leadership. We had Stephen Graham, for example, come in and speak to my firm a couple months ago. It was just fantastic having that kind of person come in. And when I do those kind of presentations and bring in these thought leaders, I'm always thinking exactly what you just said. As long as one person connects with it, I feel like it's a major success. And with this book, I've been just overwhelmed with the outpouring of support. I mean, I got emails from people in Australia, Italy, Canada, all over the United States, South America, saying some people actually connected very specifically to stories that I told. Like there's a story during World War II where my mom, she was 4, as I said, witnesses a young boy getting blown up by a bomb that was dropped. And so I wrote that story because it was part of the World War II part that I was telling. Well, somebody in Australia read the book, and that was her great uncle. And so those little connections like that are just truly amazing.
The boy who was killed was her great uncle?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's a crazy story. And when I got that message, I have chills now. It was very chilling because she said that was my great uncle. But the act of inspiration goes back to what I was saying. Those ordinary people with these great stories can touch so many. We just need to tell the stories.
Yeah. And I think lawyers are good storytellers. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Because I do watch a fair amount of Law and Order.
I'm not so sure that's very accurate, though, Mike.
No, look, I know cases aren't resolved in a day, right? Or do they go to trial that quickly? My twin brother is a lawyer, so I have a little bit of the inside, there. But it's amazing. I'm in the double digits now of lawyers I've interviewed on the show who have written books. Some nonfiction, but many fiction. So I do think there is, something. There's some Venn diagram of the drive to become a lawyer, the interest in becoming a lawyer, and then creative writing or just kind of writing in general. That there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, as lawyers, regardless of the type of law you do, as a litigator or a transaction attorney, you're doing writing. Now, honestly, a lot of it's not very creative because judges really want to get to the point, and so we use a lot of active direct. Speaking of writing, we use a lot of active direct voice. That's not a very entertaining book, and so when I mentor a lot of our young lawyers, and I tell them all the time, active direct voice. If it's not necessary, take it out because the judge doesn't really want to read it anyway. This process was very different because I was writing a story in past tense, present tense, going back and forth between 2013, 1944, 2019. And so it was one of those, it was actually very challenging.
Yeah.
But going back to something you said before, I just had this deep appreciation for the process that I never had before. And one that I now understand, you said you've written 8 books, and I've seen some of them that I understand why people become really interested in doing this.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned if it's not needed, take it out. That's a lesson that a lot of new authors really learn the hard way sometimes during the editing process.
I did too.
So, well, tell me a little bit more about that. So, in my experience, I give in 100,000 words and, 30,000 are cut. And sometimes I say, hey, wait, why are we cutting this? This is needed. They're like, no, it's not. But tell me your experience with that.
Yeah, so I have a great publisher. Radius Book Group is fantastic, and they assembled a fantastic team. So the book went through 3 rounds of editing. The first editor that was assigned was kind of a substantive editor, and we had a process for his review and feedback back to me. And the very first, I was very nervous, of course, right? Because where I currently am in my career, no one really critiques my work other than maybe a judge or an arbitrator, but very few people change it. When I got back his comments, his very first comment to the very first sentence was, "This is cliche. You need to take it out." And I was heartbroken. I was angry. I was like, "Who is this guy telling me this is cliche?" And but I told myself, I talked to my wife, and I said, I'm just going to be open-minded about this. And he's the expert. I'm not. And yeah, they changed a lot, as you know. You give up some control, and here I have a lot of control still with the book, which is one of the reasons why I went with this particular publisher.
Yeah.
But they changed the title, and I mentioned to you, one of the things my dad used to say was, "You can do it," and I was all excited about the title of the book was going to be "You Can Do It." I had a photo of my dad the day he immigrated from Italy, and I had it all figured out, right? I meet with the marketing team, and she's like, "No, we got to change this title. I'm sorry." She says, "If you Googled, you can do it." And I quickly did. And there were like 20 other books, and they're all self-help books. And I mean, to a certain extent, this book is, I wouldn't call it self-help, but it's a love story between a father, as I said, a father-son, and an ancestral background, a town. And so there was, self-improvement in there, but I struggled with that. And eventually, once I said, I'm going to give up control to the people who are true experts. The process went so smoothly. And yeah, they did take out a lot of words. That happens.
It does, but it is, it actually is a smart decision on your part, because you could fight for your children, right? Because, all these words are kind of your children, but at some point they know the business better than you do.
You can't get married to words.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So how did you better reconnect to your Italian heritage through either this writing process or even actually going back to that trip you took in 2013?
Well, first, touching the ground, just literally the act of touching it was such a profound moment. Just, I described this in the book, the drive up through the winding roads, the winding mountain, and turning left and seeing this town for the first time. It was like a place that time had forgotten. And my family, both sides, go back at least to the 1500s to this area, to this very small town. So literally every person that I could possibly think of, and I went through the ancestry.com process as well, comes from this little place. So understanding that, and then reading names on World War I and II monuments. First up, just the sense of this is where I truly am from was kind of overwhelming. But then the stories coming to life. My dad told a story of going back to World War II of one of his cousins. The Nazis were coming in, and going back to that November 11th date, you had an option. You either left as they wanted you to, you could stay behind and become their servants, or you could fight and be killed or sent up to Padua to a prisoner of war camp. And a lot of people did. There were people who did all three. Both sides of my family said, we're not staying behind and acting as your servant. We're not going to do that. So they left. But as they were leaving, my dad saw one of his cousins being chased by one of the Nazi soldiers, and he jumped. He was going to jump from one building to another and plummeted to his death. I'd heard that story a bunch, but then when my dad was there pointing to the building, again, it was just something that you didn't really understand. And we all have stories like that, Mike, and that's what's great about my story is it's every person's story. But just going back and having that sense of where we come from. And then the other things that, obviously I had always known a lot of my identity. When I was a young boy, I'd spent time with my dad and my grandfather making wine in my grandfather's wine cellar. And, but never, I'm a big wine drinker. I don't know if you are with.
Oh, yeah. Well, all these corks are mine at one point.
Yeah, exactly. But my love of food and wine started in that wine cellar that replicated the wine cellar that they had in Central Italy. And just the smells, the musk and the damp and the dirt and the salt and pepper, because there was prosciutto hanging there as well.
Yeah, and so the flies probably.
Yeah, it wasn't just, the World War II kinds of things, but it was also kind of taking me back to things in my childhood that framed me that I didn't really connect, things that I always really appreciated about my background. Now I was very proud to be willing to put this all out there in the book about that background. And, going back to, my father being discriminated against, one of the things that he always was, and I'm sure you have this in your family as well, fiercely proud of his background. He loved the fact that he was Italian. He loved the food, the culture. He loved playing bocce ball and just all those things that he never, a lot of people don't want to connect to that part of their background. That wasn't him. And so that also came to life during this trip for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a life-changing trip, sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Taught me things that I didn't know.
Have you been back since?
I have. So we've been trying to go back every other year, going in October again. Going to start off in Piedmont, going to drink some Barolo and have some truffle during the truffle festival, and then go down into Tuscany and then make our way back into Abruzzo.
It sounds like a glorious trip. I've never been. Everyone in my family has been. And my older siblings got the tour from my grandmother. And she still had she still has a sister out there. But she died in 92 now. My mother is still with us, but she's 89 and she's not going anytime soon. So it would be like almost like a solo mission, I think, for me, without anyone in the family there. But I know I've got like distant cousins out there.
You got to do it. It's people have asked me in the process of talking about the book, what would you tell people? One of the things you would tell people, and I would say, try and discover your heritage. If you have the opportunity to go back, well, first talk to your family members about your background, your heritage, where they're from. But if you have a chance to go to a place, and who doesn't want to go to Italy, right? Right. If you have a chance to go to Italy, go and spend the time there and really immerse yourself into the culture, because it's a beautiful culture. just the way that they live their lives is so different from here. And yeah, I would encourage you to do it.
Yeah.
Heck, I'll be your guide.
Well, there we'll go together. I only fly first class. I hope you're okay with that.
Same here. Yeah.
I always like to get to know people a little bit better at this part of the conversation by talking about pop culture. So I'm curious, Giovanni, when you were growing up, what were some of your favorite TV shows when you were a kid?
Oh, geez. I'm a big sports fan, so I love football. I loved a lot of the Denver Broncos and the Denver Nuggets, but TV shows, Happy Days, Three's Company were a big part of what we watched. Welcome Back, Kotter. I love Welcome Back, Kotter.
Mr. Carter. I love that show.
I still have that song on. I play it on my iTunes.
Oh, it's great. Every now and then they play it on Sirius Radio every now and then, and I'm like, oh man, I love that show.
Yeah, so those are things we watched. And then if I went to my grandparents, my grandma Nunziata would have me watch the Lawrence Welk Show.
So, my grandmother did too. Thank you. With the Bubbles, I remember Bubbles.
Right. So,
and like, was there an accordion or something involved there? Now this is going back a ways, but
there was an accordion. Yeah, I can't remember the guy's name, but he had a big accordion. And my dad was a harmonica player, and he loved whenever he had a glass of wine or two, which was frequent. He pulled out the harmonica and entertained everybody. There's stories in the book about how he serenaded my mom when he was a young man and she was a young girl, and he would go play and sing songs. And, it was just a big part of their romance.
That's beautiful. Well, speaking of songs, growing up, who did you like to listen to? What kind of music were you into?
Electric Light Orchestra.
Jeff Lynne, he's amazing.
Yeah, ELO was a big part of my early. Let's say I was born in '66, so that probably would have been 75, 76. I grew up in a small town, so I also listened to a lot of country music. So we listened to very diverse types of music, but I liked, Charlie Rich. He was certainly one of my favorites. ELO, and then Van Halen came out in VH1. All of a sudden, my musical taste changed, and I started getting into that kind of rock and roll.
God, that was a monster of an album.
It was. I still love it. Listen to it all the time.
Oh yeah, it sounds like it could have been recorded yesterday. Like for some reason, like a lot of those early Van Halen albums, they don't age.
They don't.
To me, they don't. My kids might say.
I have playlists. It's funny. I don't know if you have kids, but mine are now 29. Dante's 29, Donato's 26, and Isabella's 23. But they'll play a song from the 70s that I've heard 1,000 times, and they're hearing it for the first time. Like, Dad, have you ever heard this song from, you name it? And I'm like, yeah, I can sing it to you. I know every word.
Well, that's the thing, because our music, I believe, is timeless, and their popular music is garbage. But no, I've got 3 20-year-olds. We have triplets, and
wow.
One of them, she, my daughter Maggie, and I did a road trip. We flew down to Florida, and we drove my father's car back to Connecticut. So we had a good 18 hours in the car, and she put together a playlist on Spotify, and it was the most amazing playlist ever. I knew every song. I'm like, Maggie, what's the name of this playlist? She's like,
right,
songs my dad would like.
That's funny.
But she nailed it. She nailed it.
So I got to ask you a question. If you're in Connecticut, are you a Sally's guy, a modern guy? I mean, what's your favorite pizza?
I think they're overrated, to be honest with you. Because my grandmother made her own pizza.
There you go.
So no, they're fine. They're okay. New Haven style pizzas. Okay, I like New York pizza.
Yeah.
I like New York. But if I was going between Sally's and Pepe's, probably Sally's. Modern I've never had. There's another place called Tolly's in North Haven or East Haven, one of the Havens, not New Haven. That's it's like a little hidden gem. I think I like Tolly's better than the rest of those. But speaking of food, it's 1976. You're 10 years old. What's on the menu for Christmas Eve?
Oh, Christmas Eve was the Feast of the Seven. Well, the Feast of the Seven Fishes is what most people think of it as, but we had 10, 15 fishes. It was a 4 or 5 hour meal, course after course after course. So what, if you know that, I'm sure you do, we would have everything from shrimp to crab to bacala to sometimes lobster and sardines and anchovies, and my parents would make every fish was a different dish, and now we still do. I still carry on that tradition since my father passed. I've been hosting that event at our house, and just great times. Most people don't think that you can have fish in pasta sauce, but it's truly one of the best things. So a little bay shrimp is fantastic. And by the way, you can also have red wine with that too.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think you'd have red wine with anything.
You can, of course.
I mean, I'd say Frosted Flakes pairs well with a nice, Montepulciano.
Yeah, but food was a big part of what we did. I mean, Christmas Eve was one, but we also, I talk a lot about this in the book. Food was such a big part of our upbringing and culture, but simple dishes like polenta with just a little bit of olive oil and garlic and salt and pepper was amazing. And my mom would make this dish I just loved. She made a thin crust pizza. So it was a 2-layer pizza with anchovies, white anchovies, garlic, olive oil, salt and pepper, red pepper flakes. Man, it was so good to die for. But that's, Central Italy is about simple foods.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of ingredients because they didn't have a lot.
Right. Right. What lesson about publishing do you feel like you learned the hard way, kind of going through the publishing process for this book?
Because I didn't have a lot of expectations, I feel like there's probably a lot of authors out there who have this mind of what it's supposed to be like. And then they go through rejection and they go through years of trying to get something published. For me, since I didn't set out to write a book that was going to get published, I had a slightly different experience, but I think it's one that everyone can learn from. And this is true for everything in life. Everything happens in due time and in order and the way it's supposed to. I firmly believe that. And so what I did was I went very slow, even though from start date from when I started writing it, which was September 6th, to publication date, which was August 16th, it was 2 years. Seems like a fast time. I actually went very slow. I hired a literary consultant in New York who was fantastic. She gave me great advice on the process about, the traditional publishing route to the self-publishing to the hybrid. And there's, the world of publishing has changed so much over the years. And I interviewed a lot of different folks to serve as a literary agent. Being a lawyer, of course, it's a world that I know, the contract world. And for me, ultimately, it became about relationships. I narrowed down the list of publishers to a half dozen that fit all 3 categories: traditional, hybrid, and self. And I ultimately decided I don't want to do anything myself. And so then it kind of was those other 2. And it came down to who did I have the best relationship with that I thought really appreciated my story that I was telling. And that was Radius. And Mark Fretz over there was fantastic and put together a great team. And I would just tell people, if you're really going to devote the time to write a book, think about the way that you want to get it out. And what are you trying to accomplish? Are you just trying to accomplish a book for your family? That's easy. You can self-publish. If you want to try and touch as many people as possible, you need to go a different route. And just take the time to find out what you really want to do, and then go find the right team to work with you.
Yeah, no, great advice, and a very rigorous process you went through. It's interesting. You said you were interviewing publishers, and usually it's not in many cases, it's the other way around, trying to find someone who will actually do it for you. But it's I like your approach of having kind of it all kind of mapped out. Your 3 doors in front of you. It sounded like you went with what door number 2 is. Are they a hybrid publisher, I take it? Or
yeah, they're a hybrid, and they have they are a division of Diversion Publishing, which is a traditional publisher. So they have aspects of both, which is really what appealed to me. And yeah, when I say I was interviewing publishers, it's just it kind of goes back to a philosophy that my dad taught us, and that is, hey, you're not better than anyone else, but you are just as good as anyone else. And when I was talking to people, yeah, they were interviewing me for all intents and purposes, but I wanted to make sure they were the right person for my project. And ultimately, Radius was fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You really got to think of the end game as an author. And I often say that writing is the fun part of the
Right.
whole process, and then there's the business side of things, and you have to approach it from a business mindset, or else be prepared for your friends and family to be the only people who are going to read the book.
Yeah, and that was when I interviewed these folks and talked to everybody and was being interviewed. That question always came up. What do you want to accomplish? And I said, hey, listen, this isn't. I have a full career. I'm blessed. This isn't about selling copies and making money. It's about touching people. And so going back to what you said earlier, if I touch one person, that's all I really wanted to do. But then there's a part of you, Mike, that once you go through all this hard work, I wanted it to touch as many people as possible. That's just kind of my personality. And yeah, that business side of it is something that you need to go in eyes wide open, because it's very different, especially if you go down the self-publishing route. You're on your own.
Yeah.
You're totally on your own. And then if you go down the traditional route, you're on your own in a different way.
It's true. It's absolutely true. And at some point you have to do all the promotion, or most of it anyway. Unless you're a huge name author, the publishing house isn't going to give you their top publicists. Maybe you get a couple of days of someone's time, and then you're pretty much on your own. But it is a business that has changed so much, and if I were working for the big traditional publishers, I'd be a little nervous, because they're probably always going to be around, but with all the challenges being thrown at them, from self-publishing to the hybrid models, that turn things around a lot quicker.
Yeah.
It's I'd be nervous, and there's high quality material coming out through those types of publishing.
Well, you can get a book out now to market. When we finished our last round of editing and went to print, it was the end of March, April, and it came out August 16th of this year. So that's a relatively short time period. But yeah, if you look at Amazon, which is the biggest place to buy books nowadays, and 80% of books by new authors are sold in that arena. I think I got that right. But something like over 60% of all books are sold on Amazon.
Mhm.
If you look at Amazon's bestseller or new release list, it's filled with the hybrid route kind of authors. And I think there is going to be a shift. And this is my first experience in it, but watching it, just seeing it, unless you're one of those big names like Malcolm Gladwell or Danny Shapiro, there's always going to be a place for traditional publishers. But I think for other people like myself, you can certainly go that route. But I think the hybrid route, for me anyway, worked out very well. And like I said, you have to just figure out what you want. And are you willing to give up all control, for example, or do you want to retain some control? And even if you go the hybrid route, as we talked about, you're going to give up a lot of control.
Yeah. Fair enough. Last question I have for you is, if you could whisper some words of advice to your younger self, what would you tell, a younger Giovanni?
Well, the book is about a father-son relationship and about my dad. And what I would tell myself as a young boy, not understanding my dad and not understanding why the way, he was the way he was. And what I would tell myself is, he's doing the best he can under the circumstances with what he has. And, forgiveness is freedom. I talk about both those concepts in the book, but those are things, Mike, that we can learn in every aspect of life. Is most people, not everybody, but most people are doing the best they can under the circumstances with the tools that they have. And that's what my father was doing. And then once I learned that, and I learned to appreciate that, and I forgave the things that were not major things, but just things that, kind of put us apart for a period of time. We had just an amazing relationship. And I think we all need to remember that. You don't judge so quickly. Try to understand why somebody is doing what they're doing and who they are. And that's the best advice I would give myself, and really anybody for that matter, is don't be so quick to judge.
Yeah, I think we all need more empathy in life, specifically these days. There
Sure.
seems to be an empathy gap, in modern culture. But Giovanni, where can people buy Cobblestones Conversations in Corks, a son's discovery of his Italian heritage?
So really anywhere books are sold. So you can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, any place like that. Go to your local bookstore and ask for the book, and they'll start carrying it. You can also reach out to Radius Book Group. You can go to their website, and you can find me on LinkedIn or my law firm website, which is bhgrlaw.com, and I can help put you in touch with the place to get the book.
All right, very good. And we'll put all your contact information in the show notes. So if anyone wants to reach out and talk to Giovanni, you'll be able to do so. Just look at the show notes, and you'll have all of his contact information there. Except they won't give your phone number or email address. We'll just keep it to LinkedIn and your website and any socials you might have.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that.
All right, Giovanni, it's been a fun conversation. Thanks for joining and letting me uncork your story.
Absolutely, and salute. Next time you have a glass of wine.
Which will be this evening.
Same here.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.
This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.